The cold of the Siberian taiga does not merely surround you, it hunts you. It seeks out the microscopic gaps in your clothing, the exposed sliver of skin at your wrists, the moisture in your breath. Gabriel Stone knew this better than anyone. At 72, the former structural engineer from Colorado had spent the last 24 years living on the fractured edge of the Chersky Range. He had originally come to the Sakha Republic on a lucrative 5-year contract for an international mineral extraction firm. When the contract ended, his colleagues packed their bags and flew back to the temperate comforts of Denver and Houston. Gabriel did not. Following the sudden death of his wife, Clara, the sprawling, indifferent white silence of the Russian Far East felt like the only place large enough to hold his grief. He built a cabin of thick larch logs, adopted the brutal rhythms of the tundra, and aged into the landscape like a piece of weathering iron. It was mid-January, the heart of the deep freeze. The mercury in the thermometer nailed to Gabriel's porch had plunged to 54 degrees below 0 Celsius. At this temperature, boiling water thrown into the air instantly vaporizes into ice dust with a sharp hiss. Gabriel was in his woodshed, splitting birch logs with rhythmic, methodical swings of his splitting maul. He was a tall man, thinned by age and labor, his face lined like a topographical map of the mountains he lived beneath. As he paused to wipe the frost from his beard, he heard it. It was not the wind. The wind here possessed a low, continuous moaning quality. This sound was sharp, erratic, and laced with a frantic desperation. It was a high-pitched shrieking, followed by the metallic clatter of heavy chain. Gabriel stood perfectly still, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. The sound was coming from a dense thicket of black spruce about 400 yards to the east, a direction he rarely traveled because the terrain was a treacherous jumble of deep ravines hidden by snowdrifts. Common sense, earned through decades of surviving in a place that wanted him dead, told him to stay inside. Going out into the unbroken taiga in this weather, with the afternoon light already failing, was a fool's errand. If he twisted an ankle in a concealed crevasse, he would freeze to death in less than 30 minutes. But the shriek pierced the air again, weaker this time, vibrating with an agony Gabriel could not ignore. He drove his axe into the chopping block, walked into the cabin, and geared up. He pulled on his insulated snow pants, 2 wool sweaters, his heavy down parka, and a pair of thick, leather-palmed extreme weather mittens. He grabbed a walking axe, a high-beam flashlight, and, out of pure habit, slipped a magnesium emergency flare into his chest pocket. The trek was agonizing. The snow was thigh-deep and powdery, offering no resistance to support his weight. Every step required him to lift his knee to his chest, push forward, and sink. By the time he covered the 300 yards to the edge of the spruce thicket, Gabriel's heart was hammering against his ribs, and the sweat freezing against his base layers felt like crushed glass. He clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the gathering gloom, illuminating a horrific struggle. Pinned against the base of a dead tree was an Arctic fox. Its winter coat, naturally a pristine, snowy white, was matted with crimson. The animal was caught in a rusted, heavy-duty steel jaw trap, an illegal, archaic device likely left behind years ago by a rogue trapper and only recently exposed by shifting snow. The steel jaws had clamped down brutally just above the fox's right front paw. As Gabriel approached, the fox went into a frenzy. It lunged at him, its jaws snapping the freezing air, emitting a terrifying, guttural hiss. It was driven by the pure, unadulterated terror of a wild creature confronting an apex predator. "Easy," Gabriel rasped, his voice sounding thin and brittle in the vast silence. "Easy, little ghost. I'm not here to kill you." The fox did not understand, of course. It backed away until the chain snapped taut, then bit frantically at the rusted steel biting into its bone, breaking 2 of its own teeth in the process. Gabriel knelt in the snow, assessing the situation. The trap was secured to a massive, submerged logging chain by a heavy padlock. There was no way to detach the trap from the tree. He had to pry the jaws open. To do that, he needed dexterity. To have dexterity, he had to take off his outer mittens. In negative 54 degrees, exposed skin begins to freeze in less than a minute. Gabriel hesitated. He thought of his friend, Thomas, a retired pilot living down in the valley, who was missing 3 fingers from a momentary lapse in judgment while fixing a snowmobile. Gabriel looked at the fox. The animal had stopped struggling and was looking at him, its chest heaving, its black eyes wide and glassy with shock. Gabriel pulled off his heavy right mitten, exposing his thinner woolen glove liner, and then did the same with his left. The cold hit his hands not as a temperature, but as a burning, chemical fire. He moved quickly. He lunged forward, using his heavy forearm to pin the fox's neck into the snow, mindful not to crush its windpipe. The fox shrieked and thrashed wildly, its jaws snapping millimeters from Gabriel's face, its sharp claws tearing at his parka. "Hold still," Gabriel grunted, ignoring the animal's frantic defense. With his free hand, he gripped the levers of the steel trap. The metal was so cold it felt sticky, threatening to fuse to his wool liners. He squeezed with all his remaining strength. His 72-year-old joints screamed in protest. Arthritis, a constant companion, flared with white-hot intensity in his knuckles. The springs of the trap were thick and rusted tight. For a terrifying second, Gabriel thought he wasn't strong enough. He felt the cold seeping into his flesh, turning his fingers numb and clumsy. The burning sensation was fading, a dangerous sign that severe frostbite was setting in. He shifted his weight, driving his knee into the ground for leverage, and pressed down on the springs with the full weight of his upper body. With a harsh, grinding crack, the rusted jaws parted. Gabriel immediately yanked the fox's mangled leg free and threw himself backward to avoid the inevitable retaliatory bite. But the bite never came. The fox scrambled backward into the snow, lifting its ruined, bleeding paw. It looked at Gabriel for a split second, then turned to flee. It made it 3 steps before collapsing. Blood loss and shock had taken their toll. The animal was dying. Gabriel hurriedly shoved his numb, wooden hands back into his heavy mittens, pounding them against his thighs to force the blood back into his extremities. As the blinding pain of returning circulation washed over him, he looked up at the sky. The pale, hazy afternoon light was gone, and the wind had changed. The low moan had accelerated into a deafening roar. A buran, the feared Siberian blizzard, was sweeping down from the mountains. Within seconds, visibility dropped from 400 yards to less than 10. The world became a swirling, chaotic vortex of blinding white. Panic, a rare emotion for Gabriel, spiked in his chest. He turned around, pointing his flashlight toward where his cabin should be. His tracks, the deep trenches he had fought so hard to make, were already gone, filled in by the driving snow. He was completely disoriented. To guess a direction and walk in a whiteout was suicide. You would end up walking in circles until you froze. He needed shelter. Immediately, he turned his flashlight back to the base of the dead tree. The root system of the fallen spruce had created a small, hollow cavity in the snow, a natural trench protected from the direct assault of the wind. It was barely large enough for a man. Gabriel crawled toward it. As he did, his beam swept over the motionless body of the fox. He couldn't leave it. It was irrational, perhaps even foolish, but he had just risked his fingers to save this creature. He wasn't about to let it die in the snow. He scooped up the limp animal, tucked it inside his heavy parka against his wool sweaters, and squeezed himself backward into the root cavity. He pulled his knees to his chest, making himself as small as possible. The wind howled furiously above him, burying the entrance to his makeshift den in minutes, sealing him in darkness. For an hour, Gabriel sat shivering uncontrollably. The shivering was good. It meant his body was still fighting. The fox inside his jacket was warm, its shallow breathing a rhythmic flutter against his ribs. Then came the first twist of the night. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration, a low, resonant thrumming that seemed to penetrate the frozen earth. Then, Gabriel heard the sniffing. It was loud, heavy, the sound of massive lungs inhaling the icy air right outside his snow cave. Gabriel's blood ran cold. The scent of the fox's blood. It had carried on the wind before the blizzard hit, ringing the dinner bell for the apex predators of the taiga. Siberian timber wolves. They are significantly larger than their North American cousins, often weighing up to 140 pounds. Driven by a perpetual, gnawing hunger in the winter months. Suddenly, the snow at the entrance of the den collapsed. A massive, gray-furred head shoved its way into the cavity. Pale yellow eyes caught the ambient light, and a deep, rattling growl filled the small space. The smell of raw meat and musk washed over Gabriel. The fox against Gabriel's chest went rigid with terror. Gabriel had no rifle. He had no knife within reach. He had only his heavy mittens and the flare in his pocket. With agonizing slowness, he unzipped his pocket, his clumsy fingers fumbling for the plastic cap of the magnesium flare. The wolf snapped its jaws, inches from Gabriel's boots, testing the defenses, emboldened by the smell of blood. Gabriel could hear the crunch of snow outside. There were more of them. A pack. The alpha lunged, sinking its teeth into the thick leather of Gabriel's left boot. Gabriel roared, kicking out with his right leg, striking the beast in the snout. As the wolf recoiled, Gabriel ripped the cap off the flare and struck the igniter. Hiss, crack. A blinding, hellish red light erupted in the confined space. The flare burned at over 3,000 degrees, spitting sparks and toxic smoke. The sudden, violent illumination and the intense heat terrified the wolf. It yelped, scrambling backward out of the snow cave. Gabriel thrust the burning flare toward the opening, illuminating the swirling blizzard and the glowing eyes of 3 massive wolves retreating into the whiteout. He jammed the burning flare into the snow near the entrance, hoping the lingering smoke and sulfur smell would keep them at bay. The immediate threat was gone, but the ultimate enemy remained: the cold. As the hours dragged on, the temperature continued to plummet. Gabriel's shivering eventually stopped. This was the most dangerous physiological twist of all. When the shivering stops, hypothermia has breached the core. The brain begins to slow down. A profound, seductive lethargy washed over him. The pain in his hands and feet vanished, replaced by a strange, numb warmth. I could just sleep, Gabriel thought, his chin resting on his chest. Just close my eyes for 5 minutes. He was dying. The quiet, painless death of the freezing. As his consciousness began to slip away, something moved. The fox, which had been huddled in the bottom of his jacket, shifted. It climbed upward. Despite its mangled leg, the animal wormed its way up Gabriel's chest, pushing its head under his chin. The Arctic fox possesses the warmest pelt of any animal on Earth. It can survive comfortably at -70 degrees. The fox curled itself directly around Gabriel's neck, pressing its dense, heavily insulated body against his carotid artery. The intense, radiating heat from the animal was like a living scarf. It was a biological furnace. Whether the fox was seeking Gabriel's escaping body heat, or whether some primal instinct told it that their survival was mutually dependent, Gabriel would never know. But the sudden, intense heat against the major blood vessels of his neck sent a shock of warmth directly to his brain. Gabriel gasped, his eyes snapping open. The heavy fog of hypothermia lifted just enough for clarity to return. You can't sleep, he told himself. If you sleep, you die. Clara wouldn't forgive you. The fox wouldn't forgive you. For the next 6 hours, Gabriel stayed awake by talking. He whispered to the fox in the dark, telling it stories about the Rocky Mountains, about the wife he missed, about the daughter in Colorado he hadn't seen in 3 years. The fox never moved, maintaining its position as a living shield against the lethal cold. When the pale, blue light of dawn finally filtered through the snow, the howling wind had died. The Buron was over. Gabriel punched his way out of the snowdrift. His legs were entirely numb, his movements slow and jerky like a rusted automaton. He pulled the fox out of his jacket. It was alive, though terribly weak. The walk back to the cabin took 2 hours. Gabriel stumbled, fell, and crawled, driven by pure, stubborn will. When he finally breached the door of his cabin, he collapsed onto the wooden floor. It took 3 days for Gabriel to fully recover his core temperature. He lost the tips of his left pinky and ring finger to frostbite, a small price to pay. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, the regional doctor who visited a week later via snowmobile, assured him the fox, whom Gabriel simply called Ghost, did not die. Gabriel splinted its shattered leg using cedar twigs and medical tape. For the first 2 weeks, Ghost hid under Gabriel's iron stove, hissing whenever the man approached with plates of raw deer meat. But as the deep winter bled into the slight thaw of Siberian spring, a quiet understanding settled over the cabin. Ghost's leg healed with a permanent limp, rendering the fox unable to hunt effectively in the wild. It never attempted to leave. Years later, if a brave traveler managed to find Gabriel Stone's secluded cabin on the edge of the Chersky Range, they would find an old man sitting on his porch, drinking bitter black tea, and lying at his feet, possessing a coat as white as the snow that nearly claimed them both, would be a three-legged Arctic fox, a quiet, enduring testament to the strange, life-saving grace found in the most unforgiving place on earth.